So, Lynne, which is your overall teaching approach?
So this is where we freeze because it's on record. Right, okay, so I suppose I use approaches that come from the constructivist method of teaching. So it's building on understanding a studio culture that comes from Sean, and being a reflective practitioner. So a lot of what we've been doing over the last 12 years has been developed through our experience of how the students learn, making adjustments kind of based on that and how we want them to learn moving forward. But also it's about thinking about students of all different levels and helping them to achieve the best that they can, the best outcome for them through the process. So understanding the individual and how they can do best. And so by doing that, you're being a responsive teacher, I suppose, and kind of altering your methodology depending on what the students need at various times throughout the project. So what you've probably noticed throughout this process that we've gone through together, that you've been charting, is that it's not linear. So every week isn't the same. We adjust it depending on where they are within the programme so that they can achieve the outcomes towards the end. So starting with their personal experience of the place, so visiting the site, then they get a different experience if we just show them the drawing. So it's that combination of seeing it as a drawing and looking at it visually together to make that understanding real. Visiting the types of places that they're designing so they understand how people interact in them, how they function, so that they become user-friendly, and then how they then apply that to their own design through process of drawing, modelling, understanding 3 dimensions, and applying that into actually 2-dimensional drawings, which is the thing that I think our current day students struggle with, because they're used to seeing everything 3-dimensionally. So then to draw it in a flat way it's actually quite a challenge, but actually we were educated the other way around, weren't we? You draw it flat and then you project it up. So yeah, and about developing skills. So the process that we got in first year is repeated every single year, but it just becomes more complex because their understanding becomes more complex.
What about you, Paula?
I was about to say, I would say my approach is similar in following a lot of Sean's work. So it is constructivist, but I think I also try and have a big push toward kind of the experiential qualities in design, and trying to really get students to build models and work in 3 dimensions is probably one of the things that I try and do. Not always successfully, but it's getting students to be able to take risk, and that's probably the biggest thing.
So who writes the brief, and how do you define the learning outcomes and the goals?
So I wrote the brief as I'm the unit coordinator, and it comes right back through from when we wrote the specification for the course. So you write the specification for the course, which has learning outcomes for the course, and then you take that forward and plan it into all of the units. And then, so each unit has its own specific focus and things that they're trying to learn, which might be duplicated throughout various years. But that's what you're doing really, because there is a document process that you follow so that it is doing its job. Do you know what I mean? It's not just kind of made up on we're doing this because it might be fun. It's going through a process and make sure they learn what they need by the end of the course, so that they can complete it and move on into the profession. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah.
And how often do you review, because if I'm not wrong, even last year you had a coffee shop, isn't that?
Yeah, so we do tend to change the design projects every few years, and actually that's more for the staff than the students, because we get a bit kind of stale doing the same things, and we want to change it for our own interest. So even though the focus of the function might change, the learning outcomes don't, so that you still apply the same methodology but to a different project, if that makes sense. But yeah, we have done it for a couple of years, but next year I might change it.
Does thing change in the MA level?
In the MArc program, this year we've developed kind of an outline brief. So that outline brief refers back to the learning outcomes similar to Lynne has discussed as part of the program specification, but also to meet the Architects Registration Board criteria for part 2. So we've set out this kind of base of things I guess, elements of the design project that students need to evidence in their portfolio. But then each studio chooses different topics that they overlay. It might be a different site, it might be a different social issue or urban issue. They overlay on top of that. So each studio will have a different, I don't know what you call it, thematic aspect in very different sites. But then in order to ensure things like parity across the program, that's where that kind of structure needs to fit in. And we're working on that at the moment.
So what criteria need to be met? How can you tell the difference between the 64 and 65, for example?
That's a really good question. I think you get so experienced at looking at it, you know, but the important thing is how you justify that decision back to the students. And that's why over the years we've developed these assessment matrices that we've been using today, because that then clearly indicates to the students why that learning outcome is marked there. So that's the plan. Because you know what it's like with art and design, part of it, sometimes you just see something, you go, wow, but what you've got to do to the students is explain that wow. So what is it about that piece of work that's better than that piece of work? And that's important for their learning, but also understanding how they can get better. Does that make sense? Yeah. I say that a lot, don't I?
This might be interesting for you in that in the MArc program at the moment, we don't have a matrix. Okay? We have basically a list, so it might have for a merit or a high pass, right? It would have kind of maybe one section of the matrix on it, or kind of highlights. And then for the distinction, at the top it would be innovative, testing boundaries of, the common expectations, kind of things like that. So, but I suppose innovation is always up there with the distinction, which is setting it apart from perhaps just from a high pass mark. And but that's one of the things that we're trying to look at, is bringing some more of these matrices back in, because I think because we have different programs and different themes, so many things are different across the studios, that we do find that it's about that marketing and trying to get that parity across. So we will now have different teams assessing the portfolio. There might be one tutor there, but other people are assessing it. So, and then there's constant moderation across, but then also referring back to the brief that tutor has overlaid on top to make sure that we're judging against their brief and not. So it's kind of, because we have very specific briefs in each studio which are quite different than that criteria. It's about trying to negotiate through that, and there's staff resistance to having matrices, and I don't know how, we haven't tried it yet, but we're going to try it, so we'll see how that works. And if we can do it, I'm not sure that we'd be able to, or everyone will end up tweaking that matrix between each studio, but all to come.
So what happens when two tutors disagree on the mark? Let's say that you have a big difference in your opinion.
There would be a third marker. And so that, I suppose, our processes are rigorous. So, as you've probably seen today, so we'll always do that in twos. And when we get to the final assessment, you'll have two people looking at the portfolio together to get that mark. Then you would have the course leader, which happens to be me in this case as well, who gets the overview and makes sure that everybody is marking to the same level. And then you can make adjustments kind of between. And then you have, of course, the head of school comes in and checks the thresholds. So kind of a 58 to 68 to make sure, because that's the most important threshold in a way, because it can mean a difference for a student between the classification band. And then you've got your external examiner that comes in and checks a sample. So it's incredibly rigorous, the process, and involves staff that do not know the student personally, which is really important. So there's an can't see the word.
Validity?
Yeah, to the process, yeah, which is important really, because often students might say, oh, it's because the member staff doesn't like me, but actually that's never ever the case, because it can't be, because 5 or 6 people will be looking at that piece of work.
So the only thing I'd add is that we would also keep referring back to the assessment criteria. And reading it in the finest of detail if we need to.
Do you evaluate only the final product, or do you also take into consideration the overall performance in the studios and the attendance?
It's only what they're physically submitting. Occasionally some units have a percentage mark for the verbal presentation. We did that in earlier units this year. So if that's the case, then yes, there is a percentage mark for that. But mostly it's for the work, but it's not the final design, as you've probably seen, it's about the process as well. So it's giving the students the opportunity to gain marks for their thinking, as well as their final touch.
And I suppose in the later years, and from BA3 and then through MArc, it's assessed what's submitted in the portfolio.
How do you feel the tutorials influence and inform their design? Is it do they give them a good push forward, or?
I think it's one of the most important aspects of what we do, and what you absolutely see as students who do not attend, do not reach their potential, because you can't design in a vacuum almost. You need that interaction with others to discuss work. But it's also about building confidence, because it's a discussion. It's not a case of saying you have to do it like this. It's more a kind of question, so why have you done it like that? And then trying to draw out what's happening, but also capturing things that aren't working. But I think, that's the most important conversation of the day, I suppose. It's consistent feedback. Do you think it's valuable?
I'd say it's also coming, and because the students here aren't working in a studio, it's their opportunity to see the work of other students and have conversations with them, so that's really important. And ultimately I'd say that having these tutorials and even the presentations, which aren't final reviews, that's what you do in practice. You're sitting around with your client explaining how you developed something, justifying it, hopefully there aren't errors, and the same thing with every presentation is similar to something you would have to do in practice. So.
How easily or how hard it is to be abstract on the brief and not give very limited guidelines on what do you expect?
I think as they get up to the higher years, I think the briefs do become a little bit more open for interpretation as more time goes on, and we're always open to students challenging the brief as well, to go outside of the box a little bit. That's fine. But when the interior students get to 3rd year, they're choosing what their project is, but we're giving them a framework in which to work in. So I think it happens as they move up the school.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Our MArc students, we may pose them with a particular site or an urban area, and then they will have to use their research to come up with solutions and then develop their brief from there. So very open.
What do you enjoy in teaching?
Most of it, actually. I think for me it is about interacting with the students, working with them on their projects, getting to know them, getting to understand how they work. And I think the biggest achievements, I think, are those that come from way down at the bottom and then have that kind of light bulb moment where it all starts to click into place and they start flying. And I think that's the best moment as a teacher, when you see that happen.
I guess, and seeing students getting excited about design and the importance of it, and I actually, and also students who might have what starts off as a very wacky, out of the box idea, and that they're able to do it, and that's really exciting. But
giving them the permission to almost
Yeah,
do that,
yeah.
isn't it, and not restricting them.
And the final question, what do you think is really helping the students to develop the brief? Is it the tutorials? Is it the physical visit to, as you mentioned before, in a coffee place?
I think it's all of the things that we're doing, because I don't think you can single them out, because if you did that, they probably wouldn't get the whole story. So yeah, I'm not sure if I could define one thing. I think the first kind of half of the project is set up to give them all of the information they need, dripped in over the first few weeks, and the last part of the project is about them bringing that together and creating a design. And they couldn't do one bit without knowing about the other almost.
Yeah, I would agree with Lynne. I'd also say is precedents are really important for them to experience them.